"You bring nothing," my sister said, loud enough that the real estate office went quiet. Mrs. Carter, the closing agent, froze with a stack of papers in her hands. On the monitor above her desk, the sale price of our childhood home glowed in black numbers, $615,000. Hannah did not lower her voice. "Just put most of it toward our new house," she told the agent. "Lila does not need a share. She does not have a real family to support." I sat in a plastic chair beside my mother, fingers locked around the strap of my bag. The word "real" rang in my ears. "I thought we agreed it would be split 3 ways," I said. "A third each. That is what Dad wanted." Hannah laughed. "You bring nothing," she repeated. "You are just a signature on paper." Mom did not correct her. She stared down at the documents. My face burned. Not because this was new, but because for the first time they were saying it out loud in front of strangers. My name, Lila Keene, sat in black ink at the top of the closing statement. Co-owner, seller. The pages said I was part of this house whether my sister liked it or not. I am a project accountant for a construction firm in Denver. Every day I review budgets and sign off on numbers that could sink entire projects. I know what value looks like on paper. Yet here in a title office between a nail salon and a tax place, my own family treated me like a meaningless line item. "We do need all sellers to confirm," Mrs. Carter said softly. "Lila, do you agree to sign your share away with no proceeds?" Her eyes met mine. She had heard Hannah's tone. She had seen my mother's silence. Before I answered, my phone buzzed on the table. A notification slid across the screen. Email from Keene Property LLC. Another app flashed for a second. Portfolio updated. No one noticed. They never did. They saw my old car and simple clothes and assumed I was the one who needed rescuing. They did not see the spreadsheets on my laptop at night or the way I turned extra dollars into something that grew quietly. "She will sign," Hannah told Mrs. Carter, answering for me. "She always does. She does not even understand how this stuff works." I almost smiled at that. I understood that if I signed away my share for nothing, I was not just being generous. I was agreeing that their picture of me was true. I lowered my eyes to the statement, my name tied to years of mortgage payments, taxes, repairs. Near the bottom, a section marked Seller Proceeds. 2 lines. Net proceeds to Hannah Walsh. Net proceeds to Elaine Keene. Wiring instructions attached. There was no line for me. No account number, no share. On paper, I was a seller. In their plan, I was a ghost. My heart did not pound. It slowed. "Can you email me a full breakdown?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. "I want a copy for my records." Mrs. Carter nodded. "Of course. I will send everything to you." Hannah shot me a look, the same glare she used when we were kids. Mom sighed. "Do not make this harder than it has to be." "Lila," she murmured. "Family sticks together as long as you help." I did not argue. I signed where they pointed, watched my name crawl across the pages. When we finished, Hannah pulled the folder toward herself and hugged our mother. "This is it, Mom," she said. "Our fresh start." She did not glance at me when she said "our." That night, in my apartment in Lakewood, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I opened the email from the title company. Seller Proceeds. Allocation. Line after line of charges and credits scrolled past. At the bottom, 2 distributions. One to an account in Hannah's married name. One to my mother's. Nothing to me. I opened a new spreadsheet and called it What They Owe Me. I listed what I had paid for. The hospital bill after my father's stroke. The credit card balance I rolled into my own loan so Hannah and her husband would not default. The months I covered Mom's property taxes and late HOA fees. The repairs when the roof leaked and when the furnace died. The car payments so their credit would stay intact. As the list grew, the total climbed. 50,000, 100, 160, 240. I entered the last transfer, the one labeled Simply Help in my banking app. The sum flickered and settled. $410,000. $410,000 of my work, my overtime, my careful saving. $410,000 that had kept their lives moving while they told themselves I brought nothing. I leaned back and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. If I really bring nothing, I whispered into the quiet kitchen, what happens if I finally take everything back? The number on the screen did not move. It just waited. If someone has ever told you that you bring nothing while they live off your sacrifices, this story is for you. The winter before everything unraveled felt heavier than the years before, maybe because Denver had one of those long, cold seasons that made every morning feel like it carried a weight of its own. And on one of those gray Tuesdays, I sat at my desk staring at a spreadsheet that stretched across 2 monitors, checking formulas for a townhome development we were pushing through. Final budgeting, my fingers stiff from the cold, even though the office heater hummed behind me, and my project manager leaned against the edge of my desk with a grin that told me he had news saying, "You saved us $300,000 on that contract. Renegotiation, Lila," in the same tone people used when talking about a secret weapon, then added something he thought was a joke, but that stayed with me much longer than it should have. One day, you will own half this city if you keep investing the way you do. And I smiled because that was easier than explaining that I never thought of myself as someone who could own anything. Not after the childhood we had not, after Dad died when I was 27. And I was the one who sorted through bills and insurance papers and letters from hospitals filled with numbers no one else wanted to look at. Not after years of working, paying what needed to be paid, helping my family whenever they asked, saving what little I could in quiet corners. I lived simply, not because I did not like nice things, but because simplicity gave me control, and control meant safety. So I rented a small apartment in Lakewood, drove a Honda with a cracked sun visor, carried the same lunchbox for years, and every penny had a purpose yet to the outside world. I looked like the daughter who never quite grew up, the one with no children, no partner, no real responsibilities, and in my family, that image stuck to me like glue. Small comments piled on one another without leaving bruises, but leaving marks just the same. My mother would call and say things like, "Hannah has kids. She needs the help more," as if needing help was a competition. Hannah always won, and my sister would laugh at the things I said, telling me, "You are good with numbers, not with people," a line she loved, because it made her feel like the expert on real life, while I was the odd one out, who only understood rules written in cells and formulas. When I suggested Mom schedule a full checkup, she waved me off saying, "Do not waste money. Save it for when your sister really needs it." And the words slid into my chest like cold water, because the assumption was always the same. My needs came last. My time and effort were renewable. My wallet was a resource no one questioned using. I never argued, not because I agreed, but because conflict exhausted me in ways work never did. So I helped. Quietly. Made transfers. Quietly researched things quietly, and no one asked where my money came from or what I planned for myself. They only saw what I gave. Around that time, I spent my lunch break visiting a 4-unit building in a neighborhood shifting quickly with new cafes and renovated bungalows. And as I walked the lot with an agent who recognized my name from previous inquiries, he asked, "Are you Miss Keene from Keene Property, right?" And I nodded, even though inside a small voice still said, "This is too big for you," but outside, I kept my calm expression. Checked the roofs, asked about vacancy rates, took pictures of the basement for later review. And when I left, I felt the quiet thrill of someone building a life no one around her knew about, a life made of careful steps rather than loud victories. I never mentioned that visit to my mother or my sister because they would twist it into proof that I was strange or irresponsible or wasting time, and I did not need their commentary on something that belonged entirely to me. Not long after, we had a small dinner at Mom's house. Nothing fancy, just frozen pizza and a bagged salad and the same chipped plates we had always used. and Hannah arrived in her usual whirlwind of loudness, saying they were thinking of moving to a better school district soon. Mark's business is going to explode, using the same line she had repeated for years about the business that never actually covered its expenses. And when I gently pointed out a few things about mortgage rates and timing, she cut me off with a bright smile and said, "You talk like a spreadsheet. Lila, life does not work like your formulas." And everyone laughed, even Mom, because making me the joke came naturally to them, and I let it roll off my shoulders, though a part of me sank deeper into silence. When Hannah left the table to go to the bathroom, Mom leaned toward me over a plate smeared with pizza sauce and said something that made the air feel thinner. "I hope you understand you will have to help them with the new house. Without you, they will never qualify." She did not ask. She did not soften her voice. She said it the way managers issue instructions, and something in me stiffened because there it was again, the unspoken rule that my income belonged to them before it belonged to me, and that my ability to earn was not an accomplishment, but a tool they were entitled to use. I looked at her and smiled because that was the version of me they expected, the quiet helper, the agreeable daughter. But inside, a small crack spread through the foundation of my patience, and as I listened to the faint sound of water running in the bathroom down the hall, I realized something I had never dared to admit. I thought they leaned on me because they loved me. But that night, I heard the truth. They leaned on me because they could, and they would keep leaning for as long as I allowed it. March came with that thin, early spring light that still felt like winter in our part of Denver, the kind of month where snow could fall in the morning and melt by afternoon. And on one of those in-between days, Mom invited a few women from her church and a neighbor from down the street for a small dinner, saying it would be nice to have everyone together before the house went on the market. And I showed up after work with a store-baked pie, and the quiet knowledge that earlier that afternoon I had transferred $2,000 to cover her overdue HOA fee, because the notice had a red warning stripe that made my stomach tighten, the way it always did when something was close to penalty. And as I stepped into the kitchen, the smell of roasted chicken and canned green beans hung in the air, while Mom's friends sat at the table chatting softly, complimenting her clean floors and the framed pictures of us when we were little. I took my usual seat near the end of the table, the safe corner where people rarely directed questions, and everything seemed normal until one of the church ladies smiled at me and said, "You are lucky to have a daughter like Lila, always responsible, always there for you." Words that warmed me for a moment because it felt good to be seen even briefly, but Hannah jumped in before Mom could answer, leaning back in her chair with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether the room would bend around her opinions, saying responsible with numbers, sure, but she would be lost without us. We are the ones who really handle life. And everyone laughed lightly at first, as if it were harmless teasing. But in her tone, there was no softness, no wink to suggest it was a joke. And when the laughter faded, I caught the flash in her eyes that told me she enjoyed these moments where I became the punchline because it made her feel large. And I felt myself shrink, even though I had promised myself I would stop doing that. The conversation turned toward the planned sale of the house, and Hannah took charge of that topic, the way she took charge of everything related to family decisions, speaking with casual authority as she said, "Once we sell this place, we will finally get a real home, and Lila will co-sign. Of course, she does not need anything from this house anyway," and she said it with such finality that the women at the table nodded as if the plan had been discussed and agreed upon long ago, as if my presence there was incidental rather than integral to the property we were sitting in. One of the neighbors frowned and asked, "But is she not on the deed too?" And for a split second, I felt a small rush of gratitude toward this stranger who had the courage to say out loud that I existed on paper. But Hannah smiled not kindly and answered technically, "But she does not bring anything to this house." We brought the life here, and the sentence dropped into the quiet that followed like a heavy stone meeting, water sending ripples through my chest, and Mom simply nodded, adding, "Hannah has a point. You are young. You will be fine words she delivered with the same resigned shrug she used when brushing lint off a coat. And in that moment, I felt the familiar divide between how they saw me and who I actually was widen until it felt like a canyon. Because at 33, I was still treated as though my needs were theoretical, and their needs were urgent truths, as though I was an extra in the story of their lives. I kept my eyes on my plate, swallowing the dryness in my throat, as everyone carried on laughing again as the conversation drifted to someone's grandchild, and then a rumor about a new pastor, and I felt the kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone, the kind of loneliness that grows when you are in a room full of people who think they know you but do not see you at all. When dinner ended, I helped clear the table, because helping was the role I had always played, picking up plates and stacking them near the sink, while Hannah talked about school districts and Mark's business in that bright, airy tone she used when pretending their finances were stable. And after a few minutes, I walked into the kitchen with a handful of silverware, placing them in the sink, letting warm water run over them as I began to rinse away bits of sauce and crumbs, the sound of water soft enough that the voices drifting from the other side of the doorway reached me clearly. I heard Hannah say once the money comes in, we will keep most of it quiet. Lila overthinks everything, and I paused, feeling the water warm my wrists as I gripped a plate a little too tightly. Then Mom answered, as long as she signs, she does not need to know the details, and the words hit harder than anything said at the table, because there was no attempt at humor, no pretense, no softening, only truth spoken plainly between two people who had already decided the shape of my role in their plan. They were not discussing options or considering fairness. They were arranging a future where the proceeds of the home we all lived in, the home I helped maintain with both time and money, would be treated as theirs by right, and mine only by accident. I stood very still behind the half-closed door, letting their voices settle over me like dust. And for one long moment the kitchen lights blurred a little as one tear slipped down my cheek and fell into the foamy water mixing with the soap in a way that made it disappear almost instantly. And I stared at the bubbles, rising and popping around my fingers, realizing they did not just want my help or my income. They wanted my silence. They wanted my effort without my presence. And for the first time, something inside me pushed back, not with anger, but with clarity. A small, steady thought forming the way ice forms slowly along the edges of a river. Cold but strong, telling me that people who talk like that behind your back will take everything they can the moment you hand it over, and they will never call it taking. They will call it family. I kept washing dishes long after the voices in the kitchen faded because the warm water against my hands steadied me, yet even as I rinsed the last fork and dried my palms on a towel, the old memories that lived between all the years of holding this family together began to rise slow at first, then steady like a tide that had been waiting, and it carried me back to 2019 when Dad collapsed in the living room, when everything felt urgent and unreal, and the hospital smell clung to my clothes for days, and I remembered sitting in a narrow billing office with a woman in a blue cardigan who spoke too quickly, telling me the medical bill was $27,000 a number, that made Hannah clasp her head dramatically and say, she could not deal with this stuff. It gives me headaches, while Mom cried quietly and said we would figure it out. But no one figured anything out except me, because I was the one who stayed behind after visiting hours, ended asking for an itemized bill, reviewing codes line by line with the billing specialist, pointing out duplicates, questioning charges that did not make sense, and after 3 meetings and countless emails, the bill dropped to $16,000, still enormous but less crushing. And when the final amount came due, I worked overtime for weeks and used my bonus to pay it off, telling myself that family stepped in when it mattered. After Dad passed, life did not give us a break. Mark's small garage, detailing business, faced a slow season, and credit card debt piled to $15,000, an amount he claimed he would handle soon. Though we never had a plan for anything beyond the next week, And one night, Hannah called me crying, saying they could not breathe under the interest rates, saying I was the only one who understood numbers. So I took a personal loan in my name to consolidate their debt and save them about $5,000 in interest, and they were relieved for a moment. But soon after Hannah told friends we figured it out, we hustled, leaving my part out of the story entirely, as if the money came from nowhere and the effort was theirs alone. I told myself it did not matter as long as they were stable, but deep inside, the first small fractures of resentment had already begun. Work became a refuge during those years, not because it was easy, but because numbers told the truth, even when people did not. And through construction finance, I learned how properties moved, how loans were structured, how hidden value appeared. If you knew where to look, skills I used on quiet evenings after work, researching opportunities no one else in my family would ever consider. One afternoon, I bought a small note at an online auction, a debt tied to a rental house, whose owner had filed bankruptcy, a strange decision for someone who still clipped coupons and reused Ziploc bags. Yet I understood the risk and the return. And when the first small interest payment arrived, I felt a spark of pride. I kept completely to myself a secret achievement tucked into the background of my unassuming life. And the truth was that while my family saw me as someone who needed guidance, someone drifting, I was building something steady, something they never imagined I could build. But none of that mattered in their eyes, not when they needed something handled, and the pattern repeated again when Mom decided to remodel the kitchen, a big job she insisted Hannah had everything under control for. And when they sat down with a contractor who quoted $90,000, Hannah nodded enthusiastically, saying it sounded fair that we should not nitpick the details. But when the contract reached my hands, I saw fees buried in vague language percentages, padded for contingencies that were not specified, and I tried to explain gently that something was off, that she should slow down and ask questions. Yet Hannah rolled her eyes and said, "You are such a killjoy. This is why no man wants to marry you. Everything is a spreadsheet to you." And Mom laughed softly as if the insult were harmless, as if words like that did not sink into the ribs of the person receiving them. Everyone chuckled until the contractor himself leaned toward me and murmured, "She should listen to you." This contract is bad, and his honesty stunned me because he had nothing to gain by siding with me. It was simply the truth. Still, Hannah dismissed my concerns, insisting she knew what she was doing, but I could not watch them sign something that would trap Mom in debt. So I made calls the next day, quietly, calmly, and arranged for another company I trusted through work to review the project and offer a more transparent proposal. And when the job finally went through with the second contractor, the total cost came in $18,000 lower than the original bid. Mom celebrated the finished kitchen as if it were a dream, telling the neighbors that Hannah had such a good eye for these things, saying she always knew how to choose the right people. And though the words stung, because it was my hours of research and negotiation that saved them, I swallowed the ache and told myself it did not matter who received the credit, as long as Mom was comfortable and safe. Yet the truth, the quiet truth that lived beneath all of these moments, was that if I had not stepped in, if I had not carried the weight each time, everything would have collapsed. The bills, the debt, the remodel, the property taxes, the medical emergencies, all of it rested on my shoulders, while they told themselves the story that they were the ones holding the pieces together. And while they laughed at my caution and mocked my attention to detail, it was those same qualities that kept this family from drowning. I never told them about the nights I stayed late at the office reviewing contracts for my own peace of mind, or the weekends I spent reading about market shifts and lending changes, or the small rental note that paid me interest quietly each month, a reminder that I was not as helpless as they believed. And as I stood at the sink that night after dinner, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of their whispered plans, I realized that all these years of financial rescue had not earned me respect or gratitude. They had only made me easier to use, easier to dismiss, easier to erase when money entered the picture, and that clarity settled into me slowly, like dusk, settling over a quiet street, turning everything a shade darker than before. By the time the first hints of spring touched Denver in early 2024, the conversations inside our family were no longer about dinners or holidays or who was bringing dessert. They were about the house, the one place that held every birthday and argument and memory, and the moment the real estate market began rising again, Hannah announced with the confidence of someone who believed she was the only adult in the room that it was the perfect moment to sell, saying the agent told them the price could be higher than expected, that this was our chance to finally move Mom into something easier, something manageable, something she and Mark could handle without the constant burden of repairs. I remember sitting in the living room while Mom folded laundry, the news playing softly in the background, and I carefully laid out what seemed to me the fairest plan, that a portion of the sale should go toward Mom's retirement, so she would not have to depend on grocery shifts forever, that another part should pay off the remaining debts tied to the house and a few personal loans, and that whatever remained should be split evenly among the three of us. Because that was what Dad always talked about, his belief that fairness kept families stitched together. But Hannah only laughed lightly and said, "We will figure that part out later," as if discussing the details of distribution was an inconvenience, as if fairness was a luxury, as if my suggestion was a childish interruption rather than a reasonable proposal. I did not push it then, though something in my chest tightened, because her tone did not simply imply that my voice did not matter. It implied that my rights did not matter. Over the next weeks, the process moved faster than I expected. Hannah updated Mom about showings, open houses, offers, all with the ease of someone who assumed ownership simply by talking the loudest. And I noticed gradually that the emails became less frequent and less inclusive. Where I used to receive every notice from the agent, now I saw gaps missing, CC lines, updates forwarded secondhand instead of directly, and at first I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe the agent had made a mistake. But then I heard quiet conversations on speakerphone when I visited Hannah telling Mom that she and Mark had met with the title company separately, that they had discussed proceeds and wiring instructions, that everything was nearly arranged and they just needed final paperwork. The words "nearly arranged" stuck with me in a way that made my stomach twist. So I asked Hannah one evening why I had not received the latest documents, and she smiled too brightly and said, "Oh, the agent must have forgotten I will send them," and I waited, but nothing arrived. Later that week, while Mom was in the kitchen cutting fruit, I overheard part of a conversation through the thin wall between the hallway and the dining room. Hannah saying to the agent, "We want the proceeds sent just to us and to Mom. Lila does not really want anything, she just wants us to be okay." And my breath caught. Not because the words were cruel, but because they were crafted to sound generous, as if erasing me from the transaction was a favor to me rather than a theft. And for the first time, I understood that this was not thoughtlessness, it was intention. I worked in construction finance long enough to know how these transactions functioned, how easily information could be redirected or obscured when one party spoke confidently enough. And I realized that Hannah and Mark were attempting to restructure the deal so quietly that by the time signatures were needed, I would be overwhelmed with papers and pressured to sign without reading exactly the strategy people used on buyers who lacked experience, except here, the target was me, their own sister. That realization hardened something inside me, so I sat at my own kitchen table that night and logged into public property records, reviewing recent document filings, checking for inconsistencies, searching for updates from the title company, and when I saw that 2 preliminary documents listed only Hannah and Mom as recipients for proceeds, something sharp ran through me. Not anger, but clarity. The kind of clarity that appears when the fog finally lifts after years of ignoring what you should have seen all along. The next morning on my lunch break, I stepped outside the office building into the cold air and called the agent directly. My voice steady as I said, "I need all documents where my name appears as seller or co-owner. I work in construction finance. I understand what I am reading," and there was a long moment of silence on the other end. The kind of silence that tells you someone is recalibrating, reconsidering what they assumed about you. And then Mrs. Carter spoke with a tone that had shifted noticeably, saying, "Of course I will email you directly." I stood on the sidewalk staring at the mountains in the distance, the wind pushing my hair across my face, waiting for the email. And when it arrived, I opened the attachment, right there, scrolling past property descriptions, past signatures, past disclosures, until I reached the section titled Seller Distribution. And there it was in clear black text: net proceeds to Hannah Walsh, wiring instructions, attached net proceeds to Elaine Keene, wiring instructions attached, and nothing else. No third line, no amount for me, no mention that I existed in this sale at all. The document showed not an oversight, but a deliberate omission, a plan put in motion with the hope that I would do what I had always done: trust them, step aside, let them shape the story and the outcome. I felt something shift in me as I stared at those lines, something quiet and cold, a realization that what I feared all along was exactly what they had done. And the thought came so simply that it almost felt gentle. They had not forgotten me. They had written me out on purpose. I remember driving to my mother's house that afternoon with the faint hope that maybe if we sat down before the meeting at the office the next day, if we spoke plainly and openly, they would at least hear me, not agree with me necessarily, but hear me. And the air was cold enough that the plastic grocery bag in my hand crinkled loudly as I walked up the short path to the front door, noticing that it was pulled almost shut but not latched. So when I reached for the handle, I froze because I could hear voices inside low, at first, then clearer as I stepped closer. And I stayed there for a moment because something in me already knew that whatever I heard next would change everything. Hannah's voice cut through first sharp in the familiar way she used when she believed she was being practical, saying, "If we let Lila get a third, we will never afford the new place." And I felt my fingers loosen around the grocery bag, the oranges inside shifting weight, and then Mark chimed in with a careless laugh, as if the whole situation were a puzzle he and Hannah alone were qualified to solve. And then the words that sliced clean through the hallway reached me. "She just pushes buttons at work. She does not bring anything to this house." And in that instant, the image I had spent years holding of myself inside this family. The loyal daughter, the dependable sister, the steady one cracked so quickly and so deeply that I almost did not feel the break, just the echo of it. My mother's voice followed softer but no less wounding. "She owes us. We raised her. We helped her through college. She will be fine without this." And when she said it, I felt the breath leave my body, not in anger, not in fear, but in that strange, drifting way people describe when they watch themselves from outside their own skin. And for a second, I felt like a stranger standing on the wrong porch, listening to the wrong family discuss the fate of someone I barely recognized, someone who sounded disposable. The grocery bag slipped from my hand without me meaning to release it, and one bright orange rolled across the wooden floor toward the living room, bouncing lightly before settling under the coffee table, and the sound made them pause just long enough for me to realize I could not stand there forever. I pushed the door fully open and stepped inside with the practiced calm of someone who has learned to swallow hurt before it reaches her face, pretending I had not heard a word as I said a quiet hello and set the bag on the counter, and for a moment no one spoke, as if all three of them were silently calculating what I might have overheard. But I kept my voice steady as I repeated what I had come to say, that the fairest way was to split the proceeds evenly, after caring for Mom and settling debts, that it was not about greed, but about honoring what Dad always believed in. Hannah let out a short laugh, the kind she uses when she has already decided that logic is inconvenient, and she said I was being selfish, that I did not have a husband or kids or anyone depending on me, that she and Mark carried real responsibilities and needed the house money more because real families had real needs, and Mark stood there nodding like a wind-up doll that needed only the smallest push from her to move. Then she said the sentence that felt like a knife pushed slowly but deliberately between my ribs: "You bring nothing, you take nothing." and the words hung in the air so thickly that I could almost see them as if the room itself leaned away from me. I looked toward my mother, then hoping in some last quiet corner of my heart that she would correct Hannah, that she would interrupt, that she would say something, anything that acknowledged I had spent years keeping us afloat. But instead, she sighed, tired and impatient, and said, "Just sign, Lila, do not make this ugly. You know, they cannot do this without you." And the contradiction inside those words struck me so forcefully that it almost startled me, because she was confirming the truth beneath every insult. They needed me. They depended on me. They built their plans entirely on my name, my credit, my money, yet they degraded me as if I were an inconvenience rather than the foundation they stood on. That was the moment the hallway seemed darker than it should have been, the walls closer, the air heavier, as if the house itself were shifting into a tunnel that swallowed the version of me who once believed that loyalty guaranteed belonging. I nodded without arguing and made it through the rest of the visit with the quiet composure they expected. But inside, something had collapsed and something else had awakened. And that night, after I drove home, after I sat in my parked car for several minutes, letting the silence settle into my bones, I went upstairs to my apartment, opened my laptop, and created a new Excel sheet titled, "What They Owe Me," typing each item with the slow precision of someone cataloging not money, but years of being drained. Medical bills paid, high-interest debts refinanced, personal loans covered, repairs funded, emergencies handled, mortgage support, HOA fees, car maintenance, business debts, school supplies for the kids, every transfer, every bailout, every quiet rescue. The numbers grew line by line until the total stared back at me, 410,000, a number I never intended to use against them, a number I never even thought to measure before that night. But suddenly, it was the only thing holding the truth in place. I sat there with the glow of the screen reflecting off my hands and whispered to myself the thought that connected everything. If they truly believed I brought nothing, then what would happen when I finally stopped giving everything? And that thought carried me straight into the next morning, into the office meeting that opened the story you already know. I drove home from the office with the numb steadiness of someone who has stopped expecting softness from anyone. The sentence, "You bring nothing," still echoing with that bright, cruel clarity people use when they believe you will never fight back. And when I walked into my apartment, I did not slam anything or collapse into tears. Instead, I put my bag down quietly, turned on the lamp by the couch, opened my laptop, and pulled up the same Excel file I had created the night before, because I needed to anchor myself in facts rather than feelings, and the numbers calmed me in a way nothing else did. I listed out everything I still legally held the ownership of the house, in my name, my place on the deed. The fact that I was a co-signer on 2 of their major loans, the auto pay accounts that ran through my bank, the HOA fees for my mother's place that were tied to my card, the utilities that Hannah once begged me to take over until things get better, and somehow never gave back. And I stared at the list, not with anger, but with the slow, steady recognition that I had been holding up their entire structure for years without acknowledging the weight. Then I added the last line, my right to request an escrow hold on my share of the home sale proceeds, and wrote it down in all caps, even though I rarely did that, because the power of it made my hands go still. I closed the spreadsheet only long enough to search for a real estate and personal finance attorney, someone who specialized in complicated family property disputes. And when I read the biography of a woman in her early 50s who had gone through a difficult divorce and then built a practice helping women reclaim what was theirs, I booked the earliest appointment available. The next morning, I sat across from her in an office lined with framed degrees and discreet file cabinets, and she listened as I explained the situation, piece by piece: my mother's house, the planned sale, the attempt to root the proceeds away from me, the years of financial support, the degrading comments, and she did not interrupt or act shocked. She simply nodded slowly as if she had heard this same story behind hundreds of doors in Denver. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "Lila, you have every legal right to demand your part. You are not asking for a favor. You are requiring what the law already gives you. And if you want to protect your share, the title company must comply. And you can have your portion wired directly into an account under your control without a single conversation with your sister or your mother." I swallowed and asked the question that had sat like a stone in my throat since the moment I started adding the numbers. If I stop helping them, will they go under? And she answered without hesitation. They will have to live within what they actually bring, and that is not your crime. The words hit me harder than the insults had, because they named a truth I had never said aloud. I had been subsidizing their version of reality, and they had mistaken my generosity for obligation. Then she surprised me by asking if she could look at my financial documents to ensure I was protected fully. And when I showed her my duplex purchase records and the small fourplex investment I had made through my LLC, and the modest retirement contributions, and the RSUs from my job, she raised her eyebrows and said, "You realize you are in the top 15% of your age group financially, right?" And I stared at her stunned, because I had never thought of myself as wealthy. Just responsible, just careful, just quiet about my wins, because there had never been room in my family for my accomplishments. That moment became the anchor of everything that followed. I walked out of her office with a checklist that felt like the blueprint for reclaiming my life. That afternoon, I sent a formal email to the title company, requesting that my share of the sale proceeds be wired exclusively into my account under Keene Property LLC, making it clear that no other party was authorized to receive money on my behalf. Then I logged into my bank and turned off every auto pay I had been covering the mortgage assistance, the HOA fees, the utilities each click, feeling less like revenge and more like removing bricks from a wall that had trapped me for years. And when I deleted Hannah's access to one of my accounts, I felt something inside me exhale for the first time in a decade. I contacted my credit bureau and froze my credit profile, so no new loans could be opened in my name, not another emergency, not another surprise account, not another signature forged under the excuse of family needs, and the strange lightness that followed felt almost unreal. While I was finishing the last step, an email notification pinged softly at the corner of my screen, and I opened it, expecting another document from the title company. Instead, it was from my company's HR director announcing that I had been selected for an advanced leadership track due to my performance on the recent contract renegotiation, with an additional stock grant attached that would vest over the next 2 years. And the timing of it almost made me laugh because while my family spent their energy convincing me that I was nothing, my work quietly recognized that I was becoming something much larger than they ever imagined. I sat there with my hands resting on the keyboard as the evening light came through the window, and I realized that I no longer felt small. I no longer felt like the girl who stood in her mother's hallway, overhearing people she loved. Tear her down, I felt like someone who had finally stepped into the truth of her own worth. They wanted me small enough to fit into their idea of nothing, but the numbers told a different story, and for the first time, I believed them. The fallout began faster than I expected. Almost like the moment I stopped holding the structure in place, the entire thing finally revealed how weak it had been all along. And 2 days after I filed the escrow request, the title company sent out a formal notification to all sellers stating that because all 3 names were on the title, the proceeds would be wired to each owner separately or held in escrow until a written agreement was reached, and the email bounced straight into Hannah's phone at 7:30 in the morning while she was packing her kids' lunches, and within minutes my screen lit up with her name flashing again and again, although I let the calls pass to voicemail. By noon, she had driven to my mother's house, ranting loudly enough for neighbors to hear, telling my mother that I had betrayed the family and sabotaged the move, accusing me of wanting to see them fail. But the truth was that she was only now understanding that the money she assumed would flow directly into her account had been stopped by the simple fact that I had finally claimed what belonged to me. That afternoon, the second hit landed a contractor who had been hired to remodel the kitchen of the home Hannah planned to buy, called asking for the rest of the deposit. But because the sale proceeds were not going straight into her account, she had no money to send, and he left a frustrated voicemail saying the materials order would be paused until payment was made, and her loud confidence from earlier weeks suddenly collapsed into panicked whispers. The next day, Mark attempted to refinance his detailing business loan to cover short-term expenses and was stunned when the bank officer explained that since my credit profile was no longer tied to theirs, the blended FICO score they previously used to approve him had dropped significantly, and the officer suggested bringing in another co-signer, which made Mark's face fall because there was no one left to lean on. That same morning, my mother received a printed notice in the mail from the utility company informing her that the auto pay associated with her account had been canceled and that the next bill would need to be paid manually by the due date to avoid late fees. And she brought the paper to Hannah, asking what had happened because she assumed it was a clerical issue. But Hannah stared at it in silence, realizing that yet another thread connecting their financial life to mine had been severed. By the end of the week, the consequences reached a point they could no longer hide from each other. Hannah was at the supermarket buying groceries when she reached for her card, confident as always that even if her balance was low, there were backup payment paths linked to me. And when the card reader flashed payment declined, she froze completely, her friend standing beside her, slowly turning toward her in confusion, while Hannah tried again and again, until the screen stayed red and the line behind her grew impatient as she fumbled for another card, only to realize that none of them were linked to me anymore. She left the store nearly shaking with humiliation, clutching her half-filled cart, abandoned mid-aisle, knowing the safety net she mocked had been removed. By evening, my phone began vibrating nonstop, call after call, message after message, each one more frantic than the last, though I placed it face down on my desk and continued reviewing a contract at work because I refused to let panic dictate my attention anymore. When I finally answered one of her calls simply because the ringing had become relentless, Hannah launched straight into accusations, her voice high and brittle, as she demanded to know what I had done to the accounts, insisting that I had broken the family, shouting that I needed to fix everything immediately, because without access to the house proceeds, they could not move forward with the new place, could not pay the contractor, could not handle the utilities. For my mother could not maintain the image she had built around a stability she never truly earned. She told me I was cruel and selfish and ungrateful, as if the years of support I had quietly provided meant nothing. And when I finally spoke, my tone was steady enough to cut through her noise. I only took my name off. What you said I do not bring. There was a long moment of silence where I could hear her breathing hard, as if her mind was racing through the implications. And then she erupted again, but this time, the desperation underneath the anger was impossible for her to hide, and the call ended abruptly when she realized I would not bend. I sat there for a moment feeling neither victorious nor guilty, only clear, the kind of clarity that comes after years of being told a lie about your worth and finally seeing the truth written plainly in the numbers of your own life. And I know someone watching this might understand exactly what that clarity feels like. So let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone panic when they finally had to live without what they always swore you never brought? The meeting at the bank felt strangely ordinary at first, the kind of fluorescent-lit room people sit in when they refinance loans or sign closing papers. Yet the air carried that tight heaviness you feel when truth is about to be dragged into daylight, whether anyone is ready or not. And when I walked in, I saw Hannah sitting stiffly beside my mother, while Mark paced slowly near the window, pretending to check his phone. Each of them clearly expecting that this would be a quick session where they could convince the bank officer that everything was just a misunderstanding caused by me being too emotional. I took a seat across from them, placed my folder on the table, and waited without saying a word as the title officer entered with a laptop and a thick file. Hannah immediately leaned forward and began talking in that sweet, strained voice she used whenever she wanted to manipulate someone who did not know her well, telling the officer that we were here because her sister was confused about the distribution and that she did not understand how much strain a young family carried: the mortgage, the kids, the school district, the responsibilities. And I watched her craft the same narrative she had used our whole lives, the narrative where she was the selfless mother struggling to stay afloat, and I was the single girl with nothing to worry about except my own pride. The bank officer nodded politely but did not respond. Instead, she opened her laptop and asked for our identification, then turned the screen slightly so everyone could see the account overview. When she began speaking, her tone was calm and purely procedural as she explained that the house had 3 legal owners on the title, and that the distribution of proceeds must reflect that unless all 3 owners signed a legally binding agreement stating otherwise. Hannah quickly cut in, saying that, of course, Lila does not need a portion. She has no dependents. She has no real expenses. She does not contribute to the household responsibilities, and we have sacrificed so much to keep this family moving. The officer paused, glanced at me, then clicked another tab on her screen. Suddenly, a list began to appear, each line item neatly dated, neatly categorized money movements that most people in the room had long forgotten because they had never been the ones sending the payments. First came the medical transaction from years ago when Dad's hospital bill sat at $27,000 before I negotiated it down and paid the remainder. Then the consolidation loan I had taken to save Hannah and Mark from drowning in credit card interest. Then the HOA payments for my mother that I had covered for years without complaint. Then the utilities. Then the insurance adjustments. Then the repairs I had handled myself to keep the property sale ready. And then the down payment contribution from a previous move that everyone had conveniently erased from their memory. With every scroll, the amount grew, and the room grew quieter, the numbers stacking until the total at the bottom appeared in bold $410,000. The officer looked at Hannah and my mother in a way that made the silence feel sharper, then asked plainly, "Were you aware that Miss Keene has been financially responsible for approximately $410,000 in costs and contributions for your household over the past years?" No one spoke. Not even Mark, who always rushed to defend Hannah out of loyalty or fear or habit. My mother stared at the table as if the grain in the wood might swallow her whole. And Hannah's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out because it is one thing to rewrite a story in private, but it is another to see your version fall apart in front of strangers who cannot be manipulated by guilt or tears or family loyalty. A second bank employee who had been quietly observing from the corner, a woman in her late 40s with the tired but warm eyes of someone who had raised children alone, looked at me with a softness I did not expect. Almost like she recognized a piece of her own past in what was unfolding in front of us, and that small acknowledgement felt more validating than anything my family had offered in years. The title officer turned to me politely and asked if I would like to clarify my position, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no tremor in my voice, no desire to justify myself, only the steady understanding that I was finally speaking as someone who had earned the right to be heard. I said, "I am not here to fight anyone. I am here to make sure I am not erased from what I have actually built," and I watched the words land on them because they knew it was true. Then I added quietly, "They told me I bring nothing, I'm simply letting the math answer that," and when the officer nodded in agreement, I felt something shift permanently inside me, a reclaiming not just of money or property, but of the narrative of my own worth. A few weeks passed, and the silence between us stretched thin, like something waiting to snap, and although no one said anything directly, I could feel the consequences of everything settling over Hannah and Mark and my mother like a slow, tightening rope. Because once the house sale proceeds were held in escrow and not funneled into Hannah's account, The way she had planned the deal for their new place began to crumble. The lender requested additional proof of funds that they could not provide the contractor who was supposed to start the remodel, called twice demanding the remaining deposit, and Mark received notice that his business loan was being recalculated at a higher interest rate, now that my credit was no longer artificially propping up his numbers. I heard bits and pieces through distant relatives and through the way my mother's usual cheery church friends suddenly stopped posting pictures of get-togethers that always included Hannah looking triumphant, and the absence of those images felt louder than any update they could have given me directly. One evening near the end of April, after I had finished preparing a simple dinner and was sitting with my laptop reviewing a proposal for work, there was a knock on my apartment door. Soft at first, then more insistent. And when I opened it, I found Hannah and my mother standing in the hallway, looking nothing like the polished suburban pair they normally presented to the world, their faces bare, their clothes wrinkled, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and something that could have been fear or embarrassment or both. Hannah spoke first in a tone I barely recognized, her voice small and brittle as she said, "We were wrong. Okay. But we are drowning, and you can fix this in one click." And hearing that sentence felt surreal because this was the first time she had not wrapped her needs in entitlement or superiority. Instead, she sounded like someone who had finally realized that the person she had treated as disposable had been the one holding her life together the whole time. I stepped aside and let them in, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to face this moment without anger clouding anything. And they sat on my small couch while I remained standing, leaning lightly against the kitchen counter as I listened. They tried everything guilt about family reminders of how we grew up, hints about shared history, pleas about the children needing stability suggestions that helping them was the moral thing to do. And woven between those lines were familiar threads of "you owe us" without the bluntness they once used, because desperation softens even the sharpest tongues. My mother said she never meant for things to go this far, that she thought I understood the pressure Hannah was under, that she assumed I would always be willing to help because that was who I had always been. And Hannah added that the bank officer humiliated them, and that I could make all of this go away by simply signing an amended agreement releasing my portion. I listened without interrupting because I wanted them to finish the performance they had rehearsed in their minds, and when the room finally fell quiet, I spoke in a calm, steady voice that surprised even me, telling them that I was not placing conditions for money but boundaries for my own survival, that if they wanted any relationship with me going forward, they could not use my name, my credit, my accounts in any financial plan, not with a lender, not with a contractor, not with a school, not with any person, that if they spoke about me to others, they would speak the truth about what I had actually contributed, instead of rewriting me as a burden, that if they wanted a family dynamic, they would stop every small cutting joke, every dismissive comment, every casual reduction of my worth. My mother blinked as if she did not understand how these requests could possibly replace handing over a down payment, while Hannah stared at me with a mix of disbelief and resentment, and after a long moment she asked, "So you are not going to help at all, as if all the years before this had not been help?" I answered I already did $410,000 worth of help, and I am done paying tuition for lessons you refuse to learn. And the words settled into the room like a door closing. My mother shook her head slowly and said, "You have changed." And I met her eyes and replied, "No, I just stopped letting you write my value in disappearing ink." And the truth of that statement hung between us with a clarity that neither of them tried to argue. They stood up after a moment, realizing that I would not bend, that the version of me they relied on no longer existed, and they walked to the door in silence, pausing as if expecting me to call after them, but I did not. And when the door closed, I felt an unfamiliar lightness spread across my chest, a feeling that came not from winning, but from finally stepping out of a role I had been forced into for most of my life. I stood there for a long minute, listening to the quiet of my apartment, the kind of quiet that feels like clean air after a long storm, and for the first time I felt the absence of debt, not in numbers, but in the deeper sense of no longer being emotionally owned by anyone. The months that followed felt strangely quiet, not empty, but steady in a way I had never allowed my life to be. And as the dust settled around the choices everyone had made, I watched from a distance, while Hannah and Mark shrank their lives, piece by piece, first giving up the dream house they had already bragged about to half the neighborhood, then canceling the expensive extracurriculars for the kids, then explaining to friends at church gatherings that the deal failed because the bank changed its policy rather than admitting they had counted on money that was never actually theirs. And for the first time, they had to confront a world where my credit score and my silent deposits no longer served as the hidden scaffolding keeping everything upright. My mother adjusted in her own way, no dramatic revelations, but small shifts that told a quiet truth, like choosing store-brand items instead of premium ones, or skipping lunches out with her friends, or mentioning softly that she had started checking her statements more carefully because she finally realized money does not simply appear when someone else handles the hard parts. Meanwhile, I turned back to my own life, and using the $410,000 I had once poured into everyone else, I refinanced the duplex under better terms, which gave me room to breathe, purchased a small condo near Sloan Lake to rent out, and set up a modest fund called the Keene Women's Fund that would host community workshops for women who felt trapped in financial obligations they never consented to a tiny seed of something I wished I had known existed 10 years earlier. Months later, standing in a community center room warmed by soft lights and the scent of coffee brewing in the hallway, I watched a circle of women between 40 and 70 settle into their chairs, their faces open, tired, guarded, hopeful, depending on where life had put them, and I began speaking in a gentle version of my story without names, describing how I had been told I brought nothing, how I had been treated as a co-signer and an ATM rather than a daughter or sister, how the day I finally took my name back from their debt was the day I realized I had been carrying the weight of 3 adults who never once admitted how much I had done. Heads nodded slowly as I spoke, and I could see recognition pass from one woman to another, like an invisible string, the kind that binds people who have lived parallel lives without ever meeting. And when I finished describing the moment I walked out of the bank with my portion protected, a woman in her 60s wiped her cheek and whispered that she had been waiting to hear a story like this for years. As the workshop neared its end, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes raised her hand and asked, "What did your family say when you stopped?" And the room fell into a hush that felt almost reverent. So I let a small, quiet smile form before answering. They said, "I brought nothing." So when I left, nothing is exactly what they had to learn to live with, and the softness in the room deepened into something that felt like shared release, a moment of collective understanding that sometimes walking away is the only way to stop disappearing. Later that evening, as I drove past the old house I grew up in, now belonging to a family I would never meet, I saw the lawn trimmed neatly and a warm porch light glowing through the dusk, and instead of feeling the usual twist of bitterness, I felt a gentle closing inside me as if that chapter had been sealed without anger, only truth. I parked for a moment along the curb, watching the shadows move behind the curtains, thinking about how much of my life had been spent trying to earn a seat at a table that only took from me. And while I sat there, my phone buzzed with a notification that read, "Rent payment received Keene Property LLC," a simple line that carried the weight of everything I had reclaimed. I leaned back in the seat and let the night air drift through the cracked window as I spoke to myself, in a voice no longer apologetic. Thinking for years, I believed bringing money was the only way to earn a place in my family. But the moment I stopped paying was the moment I finally found my way home to myself. And if someone hears this and knows exactly what it feels like to be told, "You bring nothing," while someone else drains your money, your time, your health, Then tell me where you are watching from because your story might be the next one. Another woman needs to hear so she can finally say no.